In the brutal world of the American mafia, power was traditionally measured in body counts and the caliber of the guns your soldiers carried. But by 1935, the landscape of crime had shifted. The Young Turks had successfully eliminated the old guard Mustache Pete's, and the newly formed National Crime Syndicate was sitting on a mountain of cash that would make a Wall Street banker blush. However, there was a fatal flaw in the system: the men at the top. This commission was composed of 20 of the most narcissistic, violent, and ego-driven men in history, men like Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, and Vito Genovese, a man who viewed every breath someone else took as a personal insult to his authority. This was a room full of ticking time bombs, each ready to burn down the entire underworld over a perceived slight or a disputed territory. In the center of this hurricane of ego sat a man with a raspy voice, a bespoke silk suit, and a calm that felt unnatural in a room full of killers. This was Frank Costello, and for 20 years, he did the impossible. He ruled them all without ever raising his voice. Costello understood a truth that escaped his more violent peers: the greatest threat to the mafia wasn't the FBI, but the mafia itself. He saw the commission not as a gang, but as a fragile coalition of sovereign nations. If one king felt disrespected, the entire world went to war. To manage this, Costello transformed himself into the ultimate mediator. He wasn't the boss of all bosses, a title he knew invited a target on one's back, but rather the chief executive officer of peace. He spent his days not planning hits, but managing egos. He was the therapist, the judge, and the diplomat who ensured that the board of directors kept their focus on the dividends rather than the blood. He mastered the art of invisible governance, proving that true power doesn't come from being feared, but from being indispensable. The secret to Costello's control was his currency of favors. While other bosses demanded tribute in cash, Costello collected obligations. He made himself the middleman for every political connection, every legal fix, and every judicial bribe in New York City. If Albert Anastasia wanted a murder charge to disappear, he had to go to Costello. If Joe Bonanno wanted to expand his heroin trade without starting a war, he had to consult with Costello. By the late 1940s, Costello had created a system of mutual interdependence. He made it so that killing him, or even arguing with him, would be a financial and legal catastrophe for the other bosses. He didn't rule through the threat of a bullet, he ruled through the threat of a bankrupted empire. He was the glue that held 20 narcissistic killers together, and they hated and respected him for it in equal measure. Most people believe that to lead a group of dangerous individuals, you have to be the most dangerous person in the room. But Frank Costello knew that the ultimate flex is staying calm while everyone else is losing their minds. He was the architect of that silent order, the man who realized that a whisper in the right ear is more effective than a shout on the street. If you are here because you recognize that intelligence, diplomacy, and the ability to manage complex human systems are the real keys to dominance, then you are exactly where you belong. You are part of an elite circle that values the strategy of the Prime Minister over the raw violence of the street. Hit that subscribe button right now to continue your education in the high-stakes game of power. Give this video a like to signal that you understand the weight of Costello's diplomatic dehas. And I want you to head down to the comments right now and type diplomat in all caps. Let's see who among you has the temperament to rule without a gun. Now, let's go back to the most tense meeting in the history of the Commission, where a single word from Costello prevented a national massacre. The most dangerous challenge to Costello's peace came from within his own family, Vito Genovese. Genovese was the antithesis of Costello. He was a man of the old school, brutal, direct, and hungry for absolute power. He viewed Costello's diplomacy as weakness and his political connections as UN Italian. The tension between the two men represented the fundamental struggle of the American underworld, the battle between the corporate syndicate and the traditional mafia. Genovese began to whisper in the ears of the other bosses, trying to spark a rebellion. He pointed to Costello's secret visits to a psychiatrist and his preference for talk over action as proof that the Prime Minister was unfit to lead. It was a psychological war of attrition, and for years, Costello fought it with a surgical precision that left Genovese frustrated and isolated. Costello's counter-strategy against Genovese was a masterpiece of bureaucratic suffocation. Instead of hitting Genovese back with violence, Costello used the Commission's own rules against him. Every time Genovese tried to move, Costello would call for a subcommittee or an inquiry. He would drag out the process, forcing Genovese to present his grievances in front of the other bosses, where Costello would calmly dismantle his arguments with logic and profit and loss statements. He made Genovese look like a hot-headed child in a room full of businessmen. He wasn't just defeating a rival, he was discrediting a philosophy. By the time Genovese realized he couldn't win the political game, he was forced to wait for years, seething in the shadows while Costello continued to expand the mob's influence into every level of the American government. The Prime Minister of Peace also had to manage the Murder Incorporated wing of the mafia, led by the volatile Albert Anastasia. Anastasia was a man who enjoyed killing, he was the mob's enforcer, and he had a temper that could flare at the slightest provocation. Costello handled Anastasia by making him feel like a protector rather than a subordinate. He gave Anastasia the status he craved, consulting him on security matters and ensuring his family was the most feared on the streets. Costello understood that a narcissist doesn't just want money, they want to be acknowledged. By feeding Anastasia's ego, Costello turned the most dangerous man in New York into his personal guard dog. It was a high-wire act that required perfect timing and an uncanny understanding of the human psyche. For 20 years, this delicate balance held. The commission meetings were models of professional conduct. There were no shouting matches, no drawn weapons, and no threats. Costello would sit at the head of the table, his hand steady, as he mediated disputes over territory in Chicago, gambling rackets in Florida, and labor unions in New York. He was the Supreme Court of crime, and his word was final because it was always backed by the collective profit of the families. He had achieved the impossible. He had convinced 20 of the world's most violent men that it was more profitable to be at peace with each other than at war. However, the long peace had a hidden cost. By suppressing the natural violent instincts of the mob, Costello was creating a pressure cooker. The younger, hungrier soldiers who hadn't lived through the bloody wars of the 1920s were starting to view that peace as a stagnation. They wanted the glory, the hits, and the raw power that Costello had worked so hard to phase out. In the shadows, Genovese was finally finding an audience for his return to tradition message. The era of the diplomat was being threatened by a rising tide of old-fashioned brutality. Costello knew that his peace was a fragile glass structure, and one loud noise, one major mistake, could shatter it into 1,000 pieces. The first crack in the glass appeared in 1951, during the televised Kefauver hearings. For the first time, the Prime Minister was forced to step out of the shadows and into the public eye. The world saw a man who refused to show his face, his nervous, twitching hands being the only thing visible on the television screens across America. To the public, it was a moment of high drama. To the Commission, it was a sign of vulnerability. That invisible governance was becoming visible, and for a man whose power relied on being a shadow, exposure was a death sentence. Genovese saw his opportunity. The diplomat was exposed, the peace was wavering, and the Prime Minister was about to face a war that no amount of logic could prevent. The night of May 2, 1957, was supposed to be the end of the Prime Minister's reign and the beginning of a new, bloodier era for the American mafia. As Frank Costello walked toward the elevator of his luxury apartment building, the majestic, a bulky figure stepped from the shadows. Vincent the Chin Gigante, a protege of Vito Genovese, leveled a .38 caliber revolver at Costello's head and shouted, "This is for you, Frank." The bullet was fired at point-blank range, but in a stroke of near-miraculous luck, or perhaps a final act of divine diplomacy, Costello turned his head at the exact second the trigger was pulled. The bullet grazed his scalp, leaving a bloody furrow but failing to penetrate his skull. Costello collapsed, and Gigante fled, believing he had just executed the most powerful man in New York. But when the Prime Minister stood back up, he didn't reach for a gun. He reached for his legacy. He realized that this failed assassination wasn't a tragedy, it was a doorway to a level of power that Genovese could never comprehend. In the aftermath of the shooting, the Underworld held its breath. The five families braced for a civil war that would have rivaled the Castellamare-Reese conflict of the 1930s. Everyone expected Costello to unleash the Lord High Executioner, Albert Anastasia, and turn the streets of Manhattan into a slaughterhouse. But Costello, sitting in a hospital bed with a bandage wrapped around his head, remained eerily calm. When the police questioned him about the shooter, he looked them in the eye and uttered the words that would cement his legendary status, "I didn't see a thing." This wasn't just the code of omerta, it was a calculated diplomatic move. By refusing to cooperate with the law, Costello maintained his honor among the old-school soldiers. But by refusing to retaliate with violence, he forced Vito Genovese into a psychological trap. He made Genovese wait in the darkness, wondering when the blow would fall, while Costello quietly gathered his real weapons, his ledgers and his political favors. While Genovese was preparing for a war of bullets, Costello was conducting a war of attrition. He knew that Genovese had the soldiers, but he, Costello, held the keys to the city's infrastructure. He began to systematically deactivate the political and judicial protections he had provided to the family business for decades. He made it clear to the judges, the district attorneys, and the labor leaders that his services were no longer available to any family led by Vito Genovese. He was performing a corporate divestment of his influence. He was showing the other 18 bosses on the commission that life without the Prime Minister would be a life of constant legal harassment, frozen assets, and prison sentences. He didn't have to kill Genovese, he just had to make Genovese's leadership unprofitable. The brilliance of this move is something that most people who chase power never understand. We are often taught that when someone strikes you, you must strike back harder to maintain your respect. But Frank Costello understood that true respect is found in being the man who controls the outcome, not the man who wins the fight. If you are starting to see that the most effective way to handle a rival is to make yourself the source of their stability, and then quietly walk away with the foundation, then you are developing the mindset of a master strategist. This channel is dedicated to those who prefer the subtle move over the loud gesture, the long game over the quick fix. If you want to refine your ability to navigate the most complex human power structures and emerge untouched, you are in the right place. Subscribe to this channel right now and join a community that values intellectual dominance over raw force. Like this video to show that you recognize the genius of the non-violent counterattack. And I want you to go to the comments right now and type strategist in all caps. Let's see who among you is ready to trade their ego for ultimate leverage. Now, let's look at the meeting where Costello finally closed the book on the mafia's violent past. In late 1957, Costello called for a secret meeting with Vito Genovese. It wasn't a showdown, it was a negotiation. Costello looked at the man who had tried to have him murdered and offered him the one thing Genovese wanted most, the title. "You want the family? It's yours," Costello supposedly said, "but you pay me for the peace." He negotiated a massive exit package, a $100 million retirement funded by the very rackets he had built. He agreed to step down as boss, but he kept his consulting ties to the gambling interests in Las Vegas and his secret stakes in the construction unions. He did what no other mob boss had ever done: he resigned with his life, his fortune, and his freedom intact. He handed Genovese a crown made of thorns, knowing that without the Prime Minister's diplomatic touch, the crown would eventually crush the man wearing it. Costello's prediction came true with terrifying speed. Without Costello to act as the buffer between the mob and the government, and without his ability to mediate the internal narcissism of the other bosses, the commission began to unravel. Genovese, desperate to prove his dominance, called for a massive meeting in Appalachian, New York, to formalize his new role as the boss of all bosses. It was exactly the kind of loud, ego-driven mistake Costello would have never made. The police raided the meeting, arresting dozens of the nation's top mobsters and exposing the existence of the mafia to the American public for the first time in history. The long peace Costello had maintained for 20 years was shattered in a single afternoon of Genovese incompetence. While the other bosses were being hauled off to prison, Frank Costello was sitting in his garden, sipping a glass of wine, a private citizen who was legally retired. The final act of Costello's piece was the most Machiavellian. Shortly after the Appalachian disaster, a massive drug conspiracy case was built against Vito Genovese. Many historians believe that the information that led to Genovese's conviction, information that kept him in prison for the rest of his life, was quietly fed to the authorities through the very political channels that Costello still controlled. He didn't need to pull a trigger, he just had to let the system he had cultivated for 30 years do the work for him. Genovese died in a federal cell, bitter and broken. Frank Costello died in a hospital bed at the age of 82, surrounded by his family and respected by the very society he had manipulated from the shadows. Costello's life serves as the ultimate manual for the diplomacy of power. He proved that you can rule 20 narcissistic killers not by being more violent than them, but by being more necessary than them. He taught the world that the Prime Minister is always more powerful than the king because the king is a target, while the Prime Minister is the one who keeps the kingdom running. He turned the mafia into a corporate state and then successfully exited that state with a golden parachute that lasted until his final breath. He was the only man who could look at a bullet aimed at his head and see an opportunity for a peaceful retirement. As we look back at the legacy of the man who ruled without a voice, we see a blueprint for modern influence. Costello's success wasn't built on fear, but on a value. He made sure that everyone who dealt with him, from the lowliest soldier to the highest-ranking senator, gained something from his presence. And when he removed that presence, the void he left behind was so great that his enemies collapsed into it. He was the architect of a silence that was louder than any explosion, a man who proved that in the high-stakes game of life, the ultimate win isn't standing over your enemy's grave, it's outliving them while they sit in a cell you helped build. The story of the Prime Minister of Peace is a reminder that in every conflict, there is a path that leads away from destruction and toward a more permanent form of dominance. Frank Costello didn't just survive the mafia, he mastered it, refined it, and eventually, he outgrew it. He left behind no monuments, no statues, and no territory marked in blood. Instead, he left behind a lesson that continues to echo through the boardrooms and corridors of power today. If you want to rule the world, start by ruling your own ego. If this exploration of high-level diplomacy and strategic retirement has changed the way you view the path to success, then you are ready for the next level of our journey. Frank Costello was just one of many who understood the hidden levers of history. Make sure you are subscribed so you are the first to witness our next deep dive into the shadows of power. Like this video to help us bring more of these unspoken strategies to light. And before you go, tell me in the comments, if you were Frank Costello, would you have sought revenge after the shooting, or would you have had the discipline to walk away with $100 million? Let's debate the price of peace, stay sharp, stay diplomatic, and always remember, the most powerful move is the one your enemy never sees coming because it doesn't look like an attack. We'll see you in the next story.